Good afternoon, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Asia House. I'm Michael Lawrence. Very good to see you here today. And today we are delighted to be joined by Dr. Joachim von Amsberg, Vice President, Policy and Strategy at the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. Dr. von Amsberg's primary responsibilities at the AIIB include the development and monitoring of the implementation of the bank's strategic agenda, translating that agenda into the bank's lending program and budget, and developing the policies and procedures for the bank's operational investment portfolio. He joined the AIIB after some 25 years with the World Bank, and we're delighted that he's taken the time to join us here today. China first proposed the creation of the AIIB back in 2013. The idea was initially greeted with a lot of skepticism, especially from the West. But by 2015-2016, the AIIB had some 57 member countries. The UK was the first European country to join, and it did so triggering very public criticism from the United States, and the UK was shortly followed by Germany. As I understand it, very shortly there'll be 77 members of the AIIB, so membership is growing. It opened its doors in January of 2016, and thus far has made more than a dozen loans, built a staff of around 100, just over 100, but it really is new kid on the block. And it has been created at a time when the need for spending on infrastructure, particularly in Asia, is immense. The Asia Development Bank, just over a month ago, stood at this very podium and briefed Asia House on its latest report, which estimates that Asia needs $26 trillion US, or 1.7 trillion each year, for infrastructure investment between now and 2030. McKinsey estimates infrastructure globally needs something like $90 trillion US over 15 years, and much of that in Asia. So the figures are utterly astronomical. And while the AIIB is a welcome addition to the institutions trying to bridge that gap, the financing need is immense, and multilateral development banks cannot alone come remotely close to meeting that need. Now, we have in the audience today representatives from embassies and high commissions from around 20 countries, along with representatives from a wide range of industries. I think the makeup of today's audience is a small but significant measure of the global interest in the AIIB and the broader challenge of meeting the need for infrastructure investment in Asia. One key challenge is unlocking private capital and directing it to investment in infrastructure. This is an issue on which we at Asia House are doing a lot of work, and I'm sure one that Dr. von Amsberg will be addressing today. We're also very keen to hear about his experiences so far at the AIIB and the key strategic priorities going forward. In a moment, I'll invite Dr. von Amsberg to the podium to deliver his keynote address. Now, afterwards, I'll be joining him on stage for a question and answer session, and we'll invite you to participate. We welcome your comments, we welcome your questions. We really do want you to engage him while he's here. Now, just to be clear, in case there's any doubt, today's session is on the record. So, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Dr. Joachim von Amsberg.
Ladies and gentlemen, very happy good afternoon, and thank you for your interest in AIIB. I'm delighted to see so many of you here to discuss the stories and experience that led to the creation of AIIB, and to share with you the early experiences in this new kid on the block, the latest international financial institution. I was going to share with you 3 stories, and we'll try to tie them together. The first story, many of you may know as well or even much better than me. It's a story about infrastructure finance and what I would call the infrastructure finance paradox. The second story, I'm sure also many of you will know, but I still want to recount it briefly because it's so important to the creation of AIIB, which is the story, the success story of the international financial institutions. And the third story, maybe not all of you may know, which is really the story of the creation and the first year of operations of AIIB. So let me start with the infrastructure paradox story. We already heard about some of these trillions of dollars of infrastructure investment needs. I never get my head quite around what $1 trillion really is, but it's big. $90 trillion of infrastructure investment, that's twice the stock of current infrastructure in the world. So some economists have estimated we have $50 trillion of infrastructure in the world today. McKinsey says we need another $90 trillion of infrastructure. It's a lot. And a big chunk of that is in Asia, and a very significant chunk is in developing Asia, which is where mostly the AIIB operates or will operate in the future. So there are these huge infrastructure needs. They're all for connecting. Infrastructure is about connecting people, services, and markets. Everything from connecting the household of a poor villager to the electricity grid, to the connection of a big transcontinental gas pipeline. Infrastructure often is the bottleneck to economic development. When you travel to large cities in the developing world, the picture is often one of lack of infrastructure, congestion, pollution, lack of access to power, holding back investments and quality of life. But infrastructure is also the driver of economic development. Those of you who visit China or other countries which have followed a model where infrastructure has been more of a driver, advanced planning, advanced investing in infrastructure has triggered economic development, I think see a somewhat different picture of how infrastructure and economic development are related. Now, we have this huge need, the $1 trillion of infrastructure finance need, or to some extent demand. The paradox is that there actually is a lot of money that could meet that demand. We in the AIIB headquarters in Beijing literally on a daily basis receive visitors from institutional investors, pension funds, asset managers, who are keenly interested to invest in developing market infrastructure. They are keenly interested because in the financial markets today, returns are historically low. Many trillions of dollars are invested at zero or sometimes negative yielding long-term investment instruments. That means the interest in finding reasonably yielding assets is extremely high. The paradox is that the demand and the supply don't meet. Or when we talk about emerging economies, meet only to a very, very small extent. Why the demand and supply not meet has been the subject of many papers, conferences, and seminars. It's everything from the fact that a need is not the same as a demand, that somebody needs water doesn't mean that somebody is willing to pay for water, and it means even less that there is a project that is structured in a way that somebody can actually invest in the project. So there's a big path, a long path to go from a need to an economic demand to a project, to a well-structured project, and then to a pool of projects that institutional investors, pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, insurance companies are actually willing to invest in. And many institutions, I'm sure many of them represented in this room, are working on some piece of the puzzle of how to connect demand and supply. And indeed, in my view, there is no silver bullet, there is no single instrument that will bridge demand and supply, but there are many, many pieces of a puzzle one has to put together, from improvements in the policy environment, the rule of law, contract enforcement in host countries, to project preparation, to risk structuring, de-risking projects, to finding instruments to bring financing to scale for investments in infrastructure. Now, multilateral financial institutions, existing institutions such as the World Bank, such as the Asian Development Bank, have actually worked on this agenda for years, if not decades. Those existing institutions have advised government on how to improve the investment climate. They have advised government on how to set up regulatory regimes that allow private investment in infrastructure. They have facilities for preparing projects. They have helped invest in projects, helped strengthen credibility of governments to attract private investment. So actually MDBs, the multilateral development banks, have been quite effective to facilitate the little investment that has happened in this space. which now brings me to the second part of the story, or the second story I want to tell, which is really the story of international financial institutions. And I just started by giving an example of what international financial institutions such as the World Bank do. But I think there's a broader success story that, again, many of you probably know very well, but I think it's worth telling it again and again because it is often forgotten, which is a story how nations in the world, countries have come together, have created, in particular the multilateral development banks, the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and others. Development banks that have delivered, in my view, incredibly high value for money for scarce public finances. The World Bank has a paid-in capital of $13 billion only, $13 billion. So over the lifetime of the World Bank, the IBRD part of the World Bank has received no more than $13 billion of public resources. That capital, with the accumulated income and reserves, allows the World Bank to lend every year $25–30 billion, every year, in projects that not just bring money, but bring expertise, leverage policy reforms. That kind of cooperation models, where the countries of the world get together, form the financial cooperative, pay in capital that then gets leveraged in the capital markets, is an incredible success story. And I think it is worth telling it again and again as an extremely effective way of, one, spending public resources, scarce public resources, and two, cooperating on critical global challenges, whether they're issues of global growth, trade, issues of climate change, fragility, conflict, etc. I think there is an incredible success story in the international financial institutions. Now, at the same time, this success story has in certain ways hit its limit. For many years, emerging economies have asked for more capacity of the existing international financial institutions. They have asked for increases in capital, they have asked for increased capacity to invest of institutions that essentially have remained at the same size, while the global economy, and in particular the size of emerging markets, has multiplied many times. So there's been a very strong call for increasing the size of these institutions, and there has been a very strong call for reforming the governance of these institutions to give more voice, to reflect the role of emerging economies whose share in the global economy has multiplied since the creation of those institutions 70, 50, or 30 years ago. But it has been very difficult to either increase the size of the institutions or to reform their governance. It's not by accident that when the shareholders of the International Monetary Fund agreed on a rather modest realignment of shareholding in 2010, a reform that would have given, or that ultimately gave, emerging economies like China a few more percentage points of the ownership of those institutions, that when that reform got repeatedly stuck in US Congress for multiple years, that was the point when China in particular decided to launch its own initiative, which is later then becoming AIIB. So the reason why it's been difficult to reform the institutions, of course, are that it is in the interest of the existing shareholders, and that's really the G7 countries, to not be diluted, and therefore strong resistance to attempts to change the governance, give more shareholding to emerging countries, and let these institutions grow. So that's the second story. And it's really the first two stories, the story of the infrastructure finance needs and the infrastructure finance paradox, the success stories of the international financial institutions, but their inability to grow and to adjust to a changing world. That is the rationale and the motivation for creating a new international financial institution, AIIB. And that, of course, gets me to the third and final story that I wanted to share with you here today. AIIB was first launched as an idea by President Xi Jinping in 2013. The idea that he launched was to create a new international financial institutions based on the successful experience of the existing institutions, but focused on Asia, focused on infrastructure. That idea, as was mentioned, met initial skepticism or to some extent even hostility among other countries. Over the course of the following 2 years, many Asian countries warmed up to the idea and joined the initiative. And in March 2015, so just about 2 years ago, European countries, first the UK, followed by the other major European economies, decided to join this endeavor. Now, that decision to join AIIB was made possible by fundamental commitments that were made by China and other shareholders to each other about what this new international financial institution ought to be. And those commitments are at the core of why I think AIIB has been off to a very good start over the last year or so. Those commitments were, on the one side, a commitment to transparent multilateral governance. Multilateral governance means that no single country runs the institution. It means that the 57 founding members, by now increased to 77 approved members, are running this institution collectively. We are run by a board that represents all member countries. No single country has the majority. China, our largest shareholder, holds 1/4 of the capital, so China is influential, but it cannot drive decision on its own. All decisions are made in consensus and deliberation with all member countries. That's an established operating principle of the international existing organizations, and AIIB has adopted very similar governance rules enshrined in legal agreements that are the foundation of AIIB. It includes also the privileges and immunities of the institution that our member countries grant us, which protect us from infringement by any single country and allow us to operate freely in a non-political way as an international organization created by international treaty. So that's the first deep commitment that underpins AIIB, transparent multilateral governance. The second commitment was, and this was the second very firm condition for European countries to join this endeavor, was commitment to high-quality project standards. Some of the skepticism about the idea was the fear that AIIB might finance poorly prepared projects, environmentally harmful projects, projects that include corrupt practices. So the second commitment was to policies that adhere to international best practice and standards in the area of environmental, social, and governance. And those commitments were enshrined in policies that are legally binding on us as we started operating this bank. So I think these two commitments, international, multilateral, transparent governance and high project quality standards, were the basis for then elaborating the articles of agreements, the policies of the AIIB, and finally in January 2016, so just 15 months ago, opened the doors for business. At that time, AIIB began hiring staff. I joined in April last year as the 27th staff. By now we have 105 staff, and I mention that because it shows that we're still very much a startup organization. Just over 100 staff. We have a very significant balance sheet. We have $100 billion of subscribed capital, 20 billion of which are paid in, but we have only 100 staff. Compare that to an institution like the World Bank Group, the IBRD part of which has a balance sheet about twice, a bit more than twice that of AIIB, but the total staff of the group is almost 15,000. So you have very different capacities, financial versus staff and technical. So our governance looks similar to that of other institutions you may know, that like the World Bank or the Asian Development Bank. Our financial structure looks similar. We have paid-in capital. We will seek a high credit rating for our institution, which will allow us to raise low-cost capital in the international bond markets. And we then use that fund raised to invest in projects in developing countries, both private and public sector projects. That's the basic business model of a multilateral development bank that we have adopted and will build upon. We have given ourselves 3 operating principles: green, clean, and lean. It is not mean. It is green for high environmental and social standards, clean for high governance standards and freedom of corruption, lean for being efficient, small administrative cost, quick response, client responsiveness, small staff. We will be more than 100 people very soon, but we will never grow into the thousands like some other institutions. And that requires us to actually innovate and work differently. And particularly to work much more with and through partners. And I know many of you represent organizations we have already partnered with or will partner with, as co-financiers, as consultants, as advisors, as think tanks, in areas where we don't want to replicate the intelligence and the capacity of others. We want to work together with others to be able to stay nimble and lean and deliver services to our clients. So how we operate is green, clean, and lean. What we do is reflected in 3 strategic thematic priorities. First, sustainable infrastructure. So we want to invest in projects that help countries with their transition to low carbon energy, help countries with building sustainable cities. That's our first priority. Second priority is to invest in cross-country connectivity, invest in projects that connect countries through transport links, energy links, and possibly telecoms links. In a parenthesis, I may want to say a word about how we are connected or not connected to the Belt and Road Initiative, which also talks about cross-country connectivity. I would say Belt and Road and AIIB are often mentioned together in the media, but are actually 2 very different animals. AIIB is a bank with a balance sheet, with staff, with legal framework, and very clear boundaries. The Belt and Road Initiative is a very fuzzy initiative, a very broad initiative. It's more like a label than a project or a plan. But it shares some common objectives. The Belt and Road Initiative is about connecting Asia, Africa, and Europe. We are about investment in infrastructure to promote regional development. So certainly AIIB will finance some projects that fit into the Belt and Road Initiative. But we will finance them because our member countries propose them or prioritize them, and because they pass our due diligence. We don't finance them because they're Belt and Road. We are not an instrument of Belt and Road. We are a multilateral institution, but because we have a mandate that is related to the idea of Belt and Road, yes, we will finance projects that fall under that broad initiative. But we will also finance many projects that have nothing to do with Belt and Road. We have by now invested in some 13 or 14 projects of $2.4 billion, everything from small-scale upgrading of slums in cities in Indonesia, very small-scale local investments to connect people to water and transport, to mega investments like the TANAP Trans-Anatolia gas pipeline that connects Caspian gas to Georgia, Turkey, Greece, and Italy. So we're spanning the entire spectrum of very small to very large-scale infrastructure. The third priority, thematic priority, I want to mention after sustainable infrastructure, cross-country connectivity, is projects that facilitate private investment in infrastructure. This is our response to the first story I told you, the infrastructure finance paradox. We don't just want to fill a part of the big trillion-dollar gap. We want to be strategic. We want to help crack the nut of how to bring trillions of institutional investors' money into the trillions of infrastructure finance demand. For that, we are working again with some of you in the room on structures that will allow us to do that. Whether that's co-financing between ourselves and private investors, or whether it's creation of special instruments where we may take certain risks that private investors are not able to take, or where we may be able to bundle and pool certain smaller investments in a way that makes it possible for institutional investors to invest in those buckets of projects that meet certain criteria. We want to be part of the solution. Many others are working on this puzzle. We don't pretend to be the one who will find the silver bullet. I don't think so. But we do want to be part of those who build the many building blocks of the bridge that will connect the infrastructure finance supply and demand and ultimately address this puzzle. I mentioned already we are open and up for business. We are making investments as we speak. Many of those co-financed with existing international financial institutions, the World Bank, the EBRD, AIIB, and IFC, because those institutions have very large technical capacity. I refer to the large number of staff. They do very valuable work, like preparing projects. But those institutions, as I mentioned earlier, are also short of capital. So we come in with our capital to co-finance some of those projects. That's a very welcome way for us to get into the business, convey the message we are cooperating, not undermining each other, and for our staff to learn the business. But we're now developing our own capacity to originate projects, work with governments and private project sponsors, not necessarily with the participation of other multilateral development banks. So this year we expect to invest maybe some $2.5 billion, next year maybe $3.5 billion, increasing our investments year by year to what will likely be a sustainable capacity for the first years or so of something like $12, $13, $14 billion a year. Now, my own experience, I think, has been that it's been a good start because we have strong alignment among our shareholders on the core commitments that I mentioned earlier. We have a board, meaning the body that represents our shareholders, the member countries, that is actually giving us quite coherent converging guidance on what to do. So therefore, we as management are really focused on building the institution, putting all the architecture in place of actually running a bank. Because of the, I think, so far so good track record, we have been able to attract interest of additional members. So in addition to the 57 founding members, our membership has approved 20 new members, among them G7 country like Canada, who have joined AIIB in recent months. I think that growth in membership reflects the trust that has been built. The trust that has been built between China, the Asian members, and the non-regional, in particular European members, that there's a genuine commitment to build a transparent, effective multilateral institution. I think the creation of AIIB in an important way is actually strengthening the multilateral system. At a time where multilateral cooperation is probably more urgent and more important than ever before, if you look at the scale of international global challenges, whether they're climate change, whether they're refugee flows, whether they're financial vulnerabilities, all these challenges require strong multilateral cooperation. I think the fact that a country, an emerging country, China, has been able to credibly create and lead a new multilateral cooperation mechanism, a bank, is a contribution to the robustness of the system. And I think that's particularly valuable at a time where there has been some unexpected doubts in commitment to multilateral from one major country in the world. And I think in that sense, this contribution to the robustness of the multilateral cooperation is, I think, quite important. So we hope that we will make our so far modest but hopefully growing contribution to both addressing the infrastructure finance dilemma, paradox, and help fill some of these tremendous infrastructure needs for the benefits of the people of Asia, and we also hope that we can make a continuing contribution to strengthening multilateral cooperation. With that, again, many thanks for your interest in AIIB, and I'm looking forward to further discussion and engagement with many of you as partners in this project. Thank you.